Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where I feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, optimize, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's great guest, Andrew Adams. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're going to have a great conversation today that on a topic that it's definitely very relevant to many entrepreneurs, to all entrepreneurs, really. And we're going to touch on HR, but HR law, employment law, etc., and things that we need to look for and be aware of, especially in these changing times and the introduction of AI. So you are the practice leader of DarrowEverett's Labor and Employment Practice Group, where you represent employers in a wide range of litigation matters across the country, including claims of discrimination, harassment, retaliation, wage and hour violations, and contract disputes. You regularly advise clients on employment agreements, restrictive covenants, regulatory compliance, personnel policies, and day-to-day employment issues. And you have a significant experience on the transactional side, handling matters from acquire transactions to due diligence in mergers and acquisitions. So acquire, so basically you get the hire with the merger and acquisition. And due diligence, private and public offerings, venture capital financing rounds, and stock acquisitions. So definitely a wide array of topics that you touch. But today, let's talk about the changes in employment law with the new technology, AI. You know, this is definitely the hype word, right? It means automation, using AI. A lot of the employers are using AI, and they can also have access to knowledge that before they didn't have. And what do you see? What is the trend out there?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic just because it develops so quickly. And as you know, you've seen, as I've seen, as everybody out there has witnessed, it evolves on an exponential basis. And there's always new technology, there's always new development coming in the field of AI. And there is so much usefulness to it if it's done, if you launch your programs with a little bit of caution, a little bit of groundwork laid before you're implementing all these kind of AI processes. So what we see is kind of a wide scale, market-wide, adoption at this point of AI in one form or another, whether that be, as part of your onboarding process, part of hiring, part of, accounting, AP processing, things of that nature too, or, analyzing your internal kind of workflows and data and producing product through AI. But the big, risk there is there are gaps in knowledge across of it because it is developing technology. So a lot of the issues that we see coming across the board are in not recognizing risk that's out there and not recognizing where the control of the data is. So, a closed system as opposed to, an open general public system, how that data is being processed, if the data is being learned on, or if it's a completely kind of closed sandbox system. So that's kind of the general scope of what we see is, large scale implementation, but for a majority of it, not being aware of the kind of underlying risk, that comes with that, and whether that's in the field of employment and discrimination matters, or whether that's in control of IP as well.
Right. So give us some examples of where the risk can happen in terms of employment and what can be done about it.
Of course. So what you see right now is states are starting to, follow the trend now and start adopting regulations, adopting statutes that will address certain matters. And you see a little bit of a different compliance risk depending on where you're located right now, where the employee is located in most circumstances. So a lot of the risk on the employment side comes in where it's implemented generally is any kind of decision-making process. So where we see, hiring, disciplinary, or if you're looking at, terminations, large scale layoffs, things of that nature. And the
So
risk
would that
comes
be
in.
layoffs because AI is taking over the job, or layoffs because AI gave the advice, oh, here's the problems I'm running with my employee, and yeah, the chat GPT said, okay, fire them. Is that what we're talking about?
So it is column two, because as column one does happen. That's a whole different discussion about AI focused layoffs because of the implementation of AI taking in jobs. But the other piece of it is that adherence to the advice that the AI agent, or the current system that you have in place is giving you, and making that decision as opposed to a human in the loop decision. So where we see a lot of issues arising is when you're using those kind of models where the data is being trained on, it may not recognize the difference between a zip code, for example. But if you are, a large manufacturing plant that draws from a couple of communities, and one of those communities has a majority minority population, and they're represented exponentially in the data that the model is recommending for layoff, for example, that can bring in risk of discrimination there. So it's where we see a lot of those decisions being made by AI without a human in the loop to make a little bit of analysis of what that data is coming out and what those decisions are broadcast from the AI.
Okay, so as an employer, I mean, now we're talking to the entrepreneurs that are listening to us. So as an employer, what can you do in order to protect yourself from that?
So that big focus is always, you can streamline a lot of processes at a company, and a lot of, especially as an entrepreneur, if you're looking at like the startup market, for example, a smaller growth company too that's looking to implement AI just to save on costs, it makes sense. But the careful build out of that with a human review in the loop at all times is going to be essential to maintaining compliance. So, you can build in those automations, but always have that check and balance of a human review at the end of that cycle. So, you want to have the last say in the information being spit out, as opposed to just taking what the model or the agent is telling you to do.
Right, right. That's exactly right. What other areas do you see that can be tricky or that employers have to be conscious of?
So internal decision making is a big thing as well, and you can see it in some, one especially very highly publicized case. It's the Craft On case out of Delaware, where they discuss there was a acquisition of a company, there was an earnout tied to that acquisition for the seller, and it was based on the release of a product, in this case a video game, and the sales numbers for that coming down the road after the acquisition. And what we saw there was the acquirer getting worried about how large the earnout was going to be based on projected sales of that product, going to a an AI agent, an AI model, and saying, how can I get around this? And after being advised that it was going to be very difficult and very risky, continuing to prompt that AI until it provided a response that said, okay, this is how you can do what you want, even though that course of action is what led them into litigation, which they ultimately lost, and are being forced to, reinstate some of those individuals into their roles, and, reactivate that earnout. So,
But let me ask you a question.
good.
If you are prompting the AI and you are the one who is leading the AI, can't you just prove that way that you are the human who is actually making the decisions?
Well, you want it to be, but it's then, giving you steps X, Y, and Z about, what to do to accomplish your goal, even though it's not a rational goal at that point. So the risk is prompting it and giving you that feeling of authority behind your actions to say, okay, well, the AI supported this course of action. It must be a good course of action, but you've actually forced the model to say that at some point, even though it did prompt at the beginning to say this is not the appropriate course of action here, or it's extremely risk laden,
So I
pushing
guess
it to
if
give
we
you the
didn't
output.
have AI, that employer would still be sued for discrimination because that was their line of thinking, right?
Yeah, so in different contexts, it would be, if you're pushing it to make certain decisions based on, discriminatory rationale, you can force, in many cases, a model to give you the output that you want, but it does not
You
mean that
always
that
have,
there's any grounding.
you always do. I mean, it's really depends on the prompting because you are the human, you are the one who is in charge of the machine. It's not like the machine has a mind of its own. So the machine basically it's based on data, so it
Mhm.
can be discriminatory that way because it's biased according to the data that it actually takes, or you are pushing it in a certain direction, so you're still leading it.
You are, and that's where I would always plug outside counsel or attorney review at some point just to give you that kind of back and fact checking and the basis in the law to, verify that what you're doing is not going to run afoul of anything or advise you that it may. As in a lot of these circumstances, sometimes the general counsel for the company did advise them that it was the wrong course of action, or sometimes you have outside counsel review. Not to plug my profession, but that's where we come into play is to say, okay, you've gotten this output, this is what you want to do. And clients have done that in the past too. They say, okay, well, I ran it through Chat GPT or Claude or a different model and said, this is the course of action. And then you look at the output and say, okay, well, I see where you're getting to this output. This may not be the direction you want to go in. So it does happen. And that's the benefit of having kind of counsel review or an outside counsel review on that piece too.
Yeah, totally. What do you say to people that say, well, I'm just going to use ChatGPT as my lawyer?
So I see there's two big risks there. I say one is, that the data bias that we see, and the other one is in many cases it's not privileged. So we saw a big case out of New York, which likely is going to become the kind of adopted stance across the country with courts, is that communication with these third-party agents, especially when you're not in a closed system where it is learning off data, is a waiver of privilege. There's no privilege in that information. So there have been circumstances where, a litigant has to provide all of their ChatGPT questions, answers, prompts, and all of that information, whereas those discussions with your attorney would be privileged and not subject to disclosure. So you can really ruin your case. And in that case, similar vein, ruin protection of trade secrets and things of that nature because you're exposing them to third parties and kind of invalidating the secrecy of what you're putting into it.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
we do see that come up a lot. And, especially when you have conversations with your counsel and you say, okay, maybe I want to run by what they said or run this agreement that they sent me through the AI system to see, what it thinks about it. That can also be breach of that privilege as well. So, there are products that are out there that exist in a closed sandbox, environment where that privilege can be maintained, but the majority of the models out there don't maintain that privilege. And that's the risk is people go to those free models and
Even
now
if
you're
you pay,
breaching
like let's
secrecy.
say I pay a subscription to ChatGPT or to Claude, it still falls under that it's not protected. It can be used like that.
So there are circumstances where it is protected, and that's where you really have to get to those kind of terms of service and look at the exact product line that you have access to. Because a lot of the free models especially are going to have that background learning component and the data is not private. There are different levels depending on, which product you're using, the subscription service that you have that may maintain that sandbox and store files locally and not learn the data. But you have to be very careful and vet out each product that you're using to ensure that that's the case.
What about in hiring? Like if you actually upload the data that candidates send you, let's say I'm uploading resumes or somebody's uploading resumes, would that also be a breach of confidentiality?
So there's two parts to that, and the first one is it depends on where you are, and it depends on what the definition of protected personal information is for an individual. So it's not something that's been widely looked into at this point, but it's developing because a lot of those third-party providers and they're getting into some trouble right now or potential trouble. And a couple of cases out of California, they're looking to involve the third-party provider that's doing the background checks and things like that for the employer too. Um, the issue there is you're looking at, what is private information, what's considered, personal identifying information state by state, and then what's considered a data breach. Is my actual voluntary use of an external party system that's processing the data, is that a breach? Is it not? And we look into, what's specifically in there because a lot of what's being done right now in hiring is the volume processing of resumes and CVs and things like that through AI features. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on and state by state, especially looking at how they classify what's protected information, what's confidential, what's not.
Yeah. I mean, the majority of the applicants use AI in order to create their resume.
Yes, truth. Yeah.
It is. So
Yeah.
it's already there. So yeah, so there's definitely different things that employers have to be aware of. Now, how do employers use AI in a way that can put the employers at risk?
So employer use of AI, aside from what we discussed about the discrimination aspect
Now,
that
doing the employees, like how can is
employees individually.
like can employees use? Did you see cases of employees using AI that can actually put the employers at risk or get them to have to be more protected or look at it? I mean, what should we watch for as employers?
Oh, that is one of the biggest risks out there. And so that's kind of the prevalence of what we call shadow AI. And that's the use of an unapproved, unauthorized third-party AI system by employees generally. So that's when you're looking at, we have our internal systems, but an employee is taking some of the company data, throwing that into an external AI, whether they pay for it, whether they use free model outside of work, putting that information back into the system too. So that, on multiple fronts, and it depends on your field as well. So there are, depending on, the contracts that your company may have, there may be rules against that. You're seeing, terms pop up in non-disclosure agreements between companies that talk about, the ability or the inability of somebody to use, a large language model that learns on data with your data. So it could be breach of contracts, vendor contracts, or client contracts. It can, cause issues like we talked about with the confidentiality of data, employees putting trade secret information into these large language models that are learning on it. It can also cause issues depending on your field. So in my field, especially, it rises that privilege issue is what can you really put into those third-party models and what can't. So many law firms have adopted sandbox models when they've adopted AI and thoroughly vetted those to make sure there's a controlled information that's available to the employees.
Would Claude and ChatGPT, the paid version, is that a sandbox model?
So there are sandbox models within those platforms that companies can take advantage of. I know, Claude specifically, I have experience with, there are sandbox models in there that don't learn on the data, that maintain a local storage system. And, in the legal realm, we have things like Legora and Harvey that are models that are out there with sandbox systems as well. So there are models that can be adapted and used, Copilot as well, if you're on Microsoft systems. So those models do adapt to company usage. It's just that always that underlying risk of maybe an employee wants to run something through that they don't want an audit log or a record of internally at the company. They throw it into something externally, and then you've either caused a confidentiality issue or maybe a vendor issue, a client issue as well.
Right. That makes sense. So what is it, some general tips that you would give employers nowadays with the technology evolving, with the changes? What will be some tips that we can leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think the big ones are you cannot hide from it. Your employees are going to adopt it, whether you implement it or not, they're going to use it. So the best way to get in front of it is to, train your employees on it, provide a reasonable alternative to the products that are out there in the market for internal use when it makes sense for your company, whether that's in, automating some workflows for the company or building in those processes, on review of documents and things like that. Making it available and acknowledging that it is kind of the next step in what we're adopting as companies. We've moved on through many different systems. We've come from, the typewriter to word processors to computers. It is the next step in evolution of, the corporate environment generally. And so adopt it, train on it, write your procedures, and then review it and monitor it. Put it into a space where you can log it and audit it as best possibly as you can. Connect with your IT providers, make sure they're screening it and reviewing it and making sure that the AI that you've adopted really fits into your needs as a company and your security needs as well. And you providing that option for employees to utilize your controlled environment is going to stem off a lot of that extra, outside shadow AI usage that you can see when you're hiding from it, you're not adopting it at all. So the biggest thing is just definitely don't hide from it. It's going to be adopted in one way or another, and putting those kind of guardrails in place ahead of time and training your staff and your people on it is probably the biggest preventative measure you can take.
I think that's very smart advice, definitely. So, Andrew, if our listeners would like to reach out to you and ask questions or know more or talk to you, how can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, the best way is always through email, and that's the AADAMS@DarrowEverett.com. And reach out anytime, find us through the website as well, or message me on LinkedIn. I'm always available on there to message back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.